Well, thank you very much for including this paper in the program. My name is Wang. I'm an assistant professor at Vrije University Amsterdam and Tinbergen Institute. The paper I'm going to talk about today is support for small businesses amid COVID-19. And this is a joint paper with Charles Goodhart at London School of Economics and Dimitri Tomokos at the University of Oxford. When we started writing this paper, actually it was during the first nationwide lockdown in the UK. All of us three were in England back then. So it was like writing about something happening at the same time, and there was a real sense of relevance. It was quite an experience, I would say, so I'm quite glad to share the findings of our models with you today, and I look forward to your comments and feedback. As a motivation, as we know, the COVID-19 crisis and the associated lockdown measures have affected every one of us, and particularly small medium enterprises or SMEs are severely affected. Taking the estimate by Farley, the number of active business owners in the US plummeted by 22% just from February to April this year. At the same time, SMEs are very, very important. If you look at the figure in the UK, 5.9 million SMEs in the UK account for over 99% of all businesses. So in time of crisis as COVID-19, the government would really want to extend credit and liquidity via the banking sector quickly to the SMEs and to help them weather through the storm. SMEs typically rely on bank financing, and banks would have wished to be extremely careful typically in terms of monitoring their borrowers, and this could take time. In time of crisis, the speed really matters, so this may not be sufficient, and that is why government support is needed. So what the UK government did is that they provided a bounce back loan scheme. And the way it works is that the government encourages the banking system to extend credit and liquidity to the SMEs. And they know the banks would take time to monitor these loans. And that's why the government provides 100% guarantee to such loan support to SMEs. And the way it works is that if in the future the SME borrowers default on the loans, then that would not be counted as non-performing loans on the bank's balance sheet, but rather the amount of default will be absorbed by the government employing public balance sheet. The underlying rationale is that the speed really matters. The government really wanted to encourage the banks to extend liquidity and credit timely and fast. However, such government guarantees and loan support have actually triggered a series of public debate, and you can see the commentators and articles in Financial Times, Sunday Times during that period. And the focal point of the debate is that, on the one hand, the government really needs to provide such cheap credit in order to reduce unemployment in the short run. But cheap credit typically can incentivize unprofitable applicants to access the loan and stay afloat in the economy for a very long time. And that might actually lead to misallocation of resources in the future, or the so-called zombification of firms. Now, assuming the government really cares about allocative efficiency in the long run and future productivity, then it will come up with some kind of screening mechanism to really deter those unprofitable businesses from accessing those support loan scheme in the first place. One way the government can implement such a screening device is to impose a pecuniary penalty on those failing to repay the loans. But the question is, how harsh should this pecuniary penalty or the default sanction be to deter those unprofitable borrowers in the first place, while at the same time taking into account its impact on short-run unemployment? And this is the question this paper sets out to investigate. We provide a normative perspective on the social optimality of this screening device of government loan support to SMEs during this pandemic. And for this aim, we build an infinite horizon model with two sectors of oligopolistic small businesses and a screening contract. There's going to be a pandemic shock that hits one of the sectors, and this sector, you can think of it as hospitality industry, restaurants, bars, and cafes. They will be forced to shut down during the crisis, and then after the crisis, they will have an opportunity to reopen by borrowing the support loans from the government. And the other sector in the economy is going to reopen throughout the crisis, and that is the key industry, such as public transport. The government provides bounce back loans to the adversely shocked sector or the hospitality industry, for example, to reopen after the pandemic. The potential entrepreneurs, they have private information about their profitability. What the government can do in the presence of such information asymmetry is to choose a default sanction, which we model as a monetary reduction from the residual income or a fine to deter those unprofitable applicants. Note that throughout the model, we're not going to assume the government will resort to formal bankruptcy procedure as a punishment for those borrowers. The borrowers, if they default, they simply pay a fine and they can stay open in the future. What we show is the following. First of all, if we have a hawkish government or a pro-allocation government, then this government can choose a very harsh default sanction. And this default sanction can deter unprofitable entrepreneurs from accessing the cheap credit by the government in the first place. And that is why this may lead to future productivity improvement. However, this harsh default sanction will cause persistent unemployment and demand shortage in the short term. On the other hand, if we have a pro-stabilization government or a dovish government, it can choose a lenient default sanction, and this lenient default sanction can ensure full employment immediately when the pandemic's over, and the demand shortage is short-lived, which is great in the short run. However, because a lenient default sanction or no sanction at all, for example, 100% guarantee, might attract unprofitable businesses to access the loans in the first place, this might lead to future misallocation of resources, shifting the economy to a lower long-run equilibrium. And that's the key trade-off. On the one hand, we got to stabilize the short-run unemployment. On the other hand, we need to keep an eye on future allocation of resources. And the optimal policy, the optimal default sanction is likely to be somewhere in between these two extreme scenarios. Then we develop an analytic measure, stabilization proclivity, to characterize the government policy stance. We're going to explore, given different parameters of an economy, the structure, macro-financial frictions of an economy, to what extent the government is likely to be more lenient or is likely to be harsher. Then we provide a numerical example to assess the optimal default sanction. And then we provide an implication of the interest rate effective lower bound, as in the interest rate is very low, extremely low in Europe and in the US. And that is going to have major implication on the leniency or the harshness of the default sanction that the government choose vis-a-vis the loan support to small, medium enterprises during the pandemic crisis. That's the roadmap for today. Let's see how far I can get. In terms of the literature, the COVID-19 has spawned a large literature. On the one hand, you've got this group of economic papers that combine epidemiology models with a macroeconomic framework. On the other hand, you've got this large group of economics literature focusing on the role of government policies and the specific economic nature of this pandemic shock. A prominent paper is by Gary, Lorenzoni, Straub, and Werning, and we use the macroeconomic framework developed by this paper and combine that with IO insight as well as financial contracting to analyze a specific policy instruments, the default sanction, as a screening device to search for the optimal policy around the loan support to SMEs during the pandemic crisis. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the related literature extensively, but just going to jump right to the model, show you the sketch, and then discuss the results. As I mentioned, the model is a two-sector infinite horizon setup. In this economy, there are two sectors. Sector I is going to be hospitality industry. And when the pandemic hits the economy, and that sector is going to be forced to shut down. And you can think of that as lockdown measures. The other sector, Sector J, is the key industry. Think of it as public transport. It's going to stay throughout this pandemic. Now, after the pandemic, the adversely shocked Sector I can access government loans subject to a default sanction set by the government to continue production. And after production, Sector I can choose to repay or default on the government loans. To be a bit more precise, let me walk you through the timeline. Starting from T0, at the start of T0, no one was anticipating this pandemic shock, right? And entrepreneurs in these two sectors, they pay workers by using previous revenues to produce goods or hoping to produce goods. However, during time T0, the pandemic hits the economy unexpectedly. Sector I is forced to shut. Restaurants and bars are all closed. They don't produce anything, while the key industry, Sector J, remains open. Now, after the pandemic, the agency Sector I, they can choose to borrow from the government to access the support loans to repay, to reopen the business and pay the workers. However, the borrowing entrepreneurs, they're going to have private information of their future profitability. After production, they can choose to repay or they can choose to default. What the government can do is to ex ante implement a screening device to deter those unprofitable entrepreneurs. Let me spend a couple of minutes characterizing the normal times, and then I'll walk you through specifically how the pandemic shock hits the economy. Now, in normal times, there are two sectors in the economy. In each sector, there are N entrepreneurs. In total, there are Q workers, Q over 2 number of workers specialized in each sector. Each worker is going to be endowed with 1 unit of labor, and it's supplied inelastically for simplicity. The workers are going to share labor income risks within the sector. The underlying assumption is that the government provides unemployment insurance within each sector. And the policy question we're interested in is, on top of providing unemployment insurance, how much more the government should care about short-term unemployment stabilization vis-a-vis long-run productivity. Now, each entrepreneur's maximum production is to capacity is to employ Q over 2N number of workers. Now, entrepreneurs in each sector, they act oligopolistically. They engage in quote competition subject to a production technology, a linear production technology, Q equal sigma times H. A Q is the number of output they produce, and H is the amount of labor they have. And the key parameter or the productivity is sigma, and that is what we call the project return. Sigma is set to 1 in normal times. After the pandemic, sigma is going to be the private information of potential entrepreneurs. Now, in normal times, every period, there's a fraction of existing entrepreneurs exit, and there's an equal number of workers entering, and that fraction is denoted as phi. Now, phi is to reflect industry dynamism. If phi is very large, then the industry is quite dynamic. You've got new blood coming in every period. So in that sense, the government is likely to care less about short-run unemployment stabilization because the industry is very dynamic. Now, in normal times, the economy is in the efficient steady state and full employment is achieved in the model. But what is going to happen when the pandemic hits the economy? At the start of T0, the entrepreneurs in each sector, let's say entrepreneur N in sector I, uses the previous sales revenues to pay workers for production. But during period T0, the unexpected pandemic hits and it forces Sector I, hospitality industry, to close while Sector J, public transport, remains open. At the end of period T0, entrepreneur N in Sector I has not produced anything and therefore she becomes a worker. Now, when the pandemic is over, in the next period, the normal set of workers with new ideas, 5 times N, and the prior entrepreneurs, which total N, these two groups, they can choose to open businesses by borrowing government loans, F1, to pay wages and produce output. We're going to assume out of the N prior entrepreneurs, a fraction of them, alpha times N, plus the new work is 5 times and they're profitable. So their project return, sigma, is going to be the same as the pre-pandemic level. However, the other fraction of the prior entrepreneurs, 1 minus alpha times n, they are unprofitable. Their project return, sigma n, is going to be lower than the pre-pandemic level. And furthermore, for simplicity, we're going to assume their project return follows a uniform distribution. And the government doesn't know the project return after the pandemic. And then all those potential applicants applying for government loans will have the private information of their own project return or profitability. Now we're ready to walk you through the incentive structure. And first of all, I'm going to walk you through the default decisions of those potential entrepreneurs. And then I'm going to walk you through given the government default sanction, what is their borrowing decision in period T1? As I have mentioned, sigma is going to be the private information of the re-entry entrepreneurs. They are ex ante indistinguishable. We're going to assume limited pledgeability in the sense that if they borrow and default, the entrepreneurs can divert a fraction of the residual funds, and that fraction is denoted as 1 minus gamma, and the lender, the government, only takes away a fraction of the remaining funds. And that fraction gamma reflects the monitoring technology. If the lender has a very good monitoring technology and they can take away a larger fraction of the remaining funds. Now, how would the borrowing entrepreneurs decide to default or to repay the government loans? Well, suppose their project return sigma is very low. Let's look at the bottom line in condition 1. The amount of output they produce is simply smaller than the face value of the government loans. They simply don't have enough to repay, therefore they default involuntarily, simply due to bad luck. However, if their project return is high enough, they will choose to repay. Why is that? If they don't choose to repay, the lender can take away a fraction of the remaining funds, and that is going to be larger than the face value of the loans. So they will choose to repay in that scenario. The interest case is the intermediate case. If the project return, their private information, is not too high or not too low, the amount of output they produce is enough to repay the face value of the loan. However, because the lender has an imperfect monitoring technology and the fraction of the remaining funds the lender can potentially take away is smaller than the face value of the loan, then this borrower will strategically default on the government, even though they have enough funds, but because of the government or the lender's monitoring technology is imperfect, they will default nonetheless. As we can observe, the higher the project return, the lower the likelihood of default. So knowing this incentive structure, what the government can do is to implement a default sanction, which we denote as lambda 1, to deter the inefficient or unprofitable entrepreneurs and reduce aggregate default. Now, knowing that the government can implement a default sanction lambda 1, how is this going to affect the potential borrower's borrowing decision? Note that the potential entrepreneurs, their businesses were shut down in period T0, so they become workers immediately. in period T1, the next period, they have two choices. They either choose to stay as a worker, which they will, in which scenario they will get this outside option of getting wages from the producer, or they can choose to reapply for government loans and reopen business. Now, the condition two is simply the incentive compatibility constraint of those potential applicants. On the right-hand side, it is the outside option they've got by staying as a worker. On the left-hand side is what they will get if they borrow and choose to default. If they choose to default, they keep a fraction of the remaining funds, but they have to pay a default sanction to the government. As the government increases the default sanction lambda 1, the inefficient entrepreneurs with low profitability may be deterred from applying in the first place, and this is a way of reducing aggregate default. And this claim will be proven as we define the equilibrium later on. Throughout, the government does not violate its budget constraint. Moving on to the other side of the economy, in terms of the workers, their preferences respect the following utility function. It is a constant elasticity of substitution, which satisfies the usual condition of utility functions. They derive utility from two types of goods. One type of goods is produced by the hospitality industry, and the other type of goods is produced by the public transport, the key industry that remains open throughout the pandemic. Two parameters emerge. One is the constant elasticity of substitution, 1 over nu, between these two types of goods. And the other parameter is the intertemporal elasticity of substitution, 1 over delta. If nu is larger than delta, it implies that these two goods are actually complements. Suppose if the hospitality industry is booming in a touristy city, then it might attract people to come over to the city to enjoy the hospitality industry, which gives rise to a boom to the public transport. But if the hospitality industry in this touristy city is suffering, let's say due to the pandemic, and that might negatively affect public transport. And this is the so-called aggregate demand externality, which will have implication on our design of this default sanction as a screening device. Now, the workers respect the budget constraints. They've got the wages to pay. They've got the wages as income to pay for these two types of goods. At the same time, they have a one-period bond in zero supply within each sector to share labor income risks, which we interpret as government providing unemployment insurance within each sector. Now, because the setup satisfies Gorman aggregation, we can derive an aggregate order equation, which is expressed in equation 3. During normal times, the interest rate is just going to be 1 over beta. Beta is the discount factor minus 1. However, in times of crisis, this interest rate is going to change. What's the dynamic on the interest rate? Well, suppose we're hit by this pandemic, and also suppose these two types of goods are complements, and that is to say nu is larger than delta, then we can show the interest rate at T0 is actually going to be lower than the pre-pandemic level. And that is to say the supply shock actually causes a demand shortage, which is quite peculiar because typically when a negative supply shock hits, this sector has not produced anything. And that would mean the marginal utility of consumption is very high because the producer has not produced anything and everybody becomes very hungry. And the marginal utility of consumption is high, and that is a demand boom, which caused for the interest rate to rise in the current period to equilibrate the economy. However, in this two-sector economy, this is not necessarily the case, because if these two goods are complements, let's say hospitality industry is shut, and that is going to negatively affect the demand for public transport, And then that actually causes the marginal utility of consumption to go down, which leads to a demand shortage, and the interest rate has to fall in order for the economy to equilibrate. And this has an interesting implication, and that is at the low interest rate environment, when the interest rate cannot fall even lower, then closing the hospitality industry is likely to lead to demand shortage in the industry that remains open throughout the pandemic, causing involuntary unemployment. And that would induce the government to be more lenient in terms of choosing the default sanction um, as a screening device. So this is a result inspired by the paper by Gary and co-authors, which they show in a multi-sector infinite horizon setup. When goods share complementarity, a negative supply shock can actually lead to persistent demand shortage. And this will have an interesting implication on our design of the default sanction as a screening device. Now we're ready to define the equilibrium. The two-sector equilibrium with imperfect competition in infinite horizons is defined as an allocation with prices given the screening device lambda 1, such that the non-price taking entrepreneurs engage in no competition and they choose their actions simultaneously taking into account their price impact. And the agents maximize subject to re-entry frictions, the incentive constraint, and the budget constraint. Goods markets, labor markets, loan markets clear, and expectations are rational. Now we're ready to characterize the equilibrium and also look for the harsh default sanction and derive the lenient default sanction and analyze their impact and implication for the macroeconomy. Let's use the capitalized letter M to denote the number of re-entry entrepreneurs the government allows to access the loan scheme. We can show choosing the default sanction lambda 1 is equivalent to choosing how many of entrepreneurs the government allows to reapply to apply for government loans and reopen businesses. In other words, there's a one-to-one mapping between default sanction lambda 1 and the number of re-entering entrepreneurs M. What we first show is that an increase in the default sanction lambda 1, which actually leads to a decrease in M, this leads to a higher profitability of the marginal entrepreneurs and fewer defaults, which is a monotonic relationship. And given the monotonic relationship, we're ready to state the main theorem of the paper, which derives the harsh default sanction lambda A1 and the lenient default sanction lambda B1. A harsh sanction indicates a hawkish or pro-allocation government, and a lenient sanction indicates a pro-stabilization or a dovish government. Now, given monotonicity, we're able to derive an analytic expression for the harsh default sanction. Suppose the government sets a very harsh default sanction, lambda 1 is larger than lambda A1, and lambda A1 is derived as the parameters of the model, which is a very high value, reflecting a harsh stance of the government. Then we show that the total number of entrepreneurs enter that are profitable is 5 times alpha, 5 plus alpha times n. So the normal set of workers with new ideas and the profitable prior entrepreneurs, they will get access to the loans because they will not be deterred from re-entering despite this harsh default sanction because they know they're profitable. However, all the inefficient entrepreneurs, they will stay out because they know they're unprofitable and they will have to pay a very harsh default sanction if they fail to repay the loans. They will simply stay out as workers to get the outside option. In that scenario, no one defaults. However, sector I is going to suffer unemployment in the short run persistently. Now let's go to the other polar extreme. Suppose we have a very dovish government, and this government sets a default sanction lambda b1, which we derive as d parameters of the model, and that reflects a very low value for the default sanction. Then we can show all the inefficient projects, they will go ahead, and these entrepreneurs, they will default, but then the sector achieves full employment in period T1 and beyond. So some amount of inefficient projects will go ahead because the default sanction is very lenient, and some will not. Sector I achieves full employment immediately when the pandemic is over, but this is likely to have implication for future allocation of resources. Or even more lenient, let's say the government doesn't implement any default sanction, default punishment whatsoever, and provides 100% guarantee. Then what we show is that all the prior entrepreneurs, they will apply for the loans, and some of the profitable applicants will be crowded out. What is this to do with the aggregate demand externality and demand shortage? Well, suppose the government implements a harsh default sanction, and I suppose these two goods are complements. What we show is that the interest rate is going to be lower than the pre-pandemic level. And from T0 onwards, it will take a few periods for the interest rate to gradually return to the pre-pandemic level. So interest rate is going to be persistently low, and demand shortage is going to be persistently low as well. However, if the government is dovish, then what we show is that interest rate in period T0, that is when the pandemic hits, is going to go down as usual. But from period T1 onwards, the interest rate immediately jumps to the pre-pandemic level, and the demand shortage is short-lived. Now, what we're going to do next is to search for the social optimal. As you might have thought, the social optimality of the default sanction is likely to be somewhere in between the extremely dovish government that sets a lenient default sanction and the extremely hawkish government that sets a harsh default sanction. What we're going to do next is to define the social welfare function first, and then we'll allow the government to choose the default sanction, which is equivalent to choosing the M, and that is the number of entrepreneurs the government allows to access the loans, subject to the decentralized optimality conditions. Now, assuming the government assigns equal weights to everyone in the economy, and given constant elasticity of substitution preferences and homogeneous of degree 1, we can derive the aggregate social welfare function expressed in equation 4. What we do simply is to substitute in, replace the consumption with the decentralized optimality conditions that we derive, and then re-express this social welfare function as a function of M, which is the number of re-entry entrepreneurs, and other exogenous parameters. Now, typically, we can just derive the first order condition of the social welfare function with respect to M. But there's a technical challenge. The technical challenge is that the time t is also going to be a function of M as well, because if M is very small, and that implies the government is very hawkish, and then it would take quite a few number of periods for the economy to return to a long-run steady state. Whereas if the M is very large, that means the government is lenient, it would take a fewer periods, time t, for the economy to return to a long-run steady state. And that is why period t is likely to be a function of M, and it involves a ceiling function, which we do not attempt to derive an analytic expression. The way we go about it is as follows. First, we derive an analytic expression, measure, conditional on M, which we call stabilization proclivity, to characterize the government's choice of default sanctions. So the higher the stabilization proclivity, then the more likely the government will set a lenient sanction. And we're going to characterize what are the key parameters and macro financial frictions that can change the government's proclivity of stabilization. And then we're going to solve the optimal default sanction lambda 1 equivalent to the optimal m in a numerical fashion. So first, we come up with this stabilization proclivity. I'll spare you with the math expression, just walk you through the intuition. Now, let's look at the numerator of the stabilization proclivity. What the numerator says is if the government becomes a little bit more lenient by increasing m a little bit, just a little bit, and what is the addition or the increase of the short-run utility in the social welfare? Now, the denominator says if the government becomes a little bit more lenient, and what is the loss of the utility in the long run? So essentially, the stabilization proclivity, you can think of it as the marginal rate of substitution between the period just before full employment and the period when full employment is achieved. In other words, SP, or stabilization proclivity, is the marginal rate of substitution between the short run and the long run, loosely speaking. So if SP is large, then the government might be more pro-stabilization because you will get more increase in the short run utility than the loss of long run utility. However, if the SP is small, then the government might be more pro-allocation. So the trade-off is essentially between short-term stabilization vis-a-vis long-run allocation. Given the analytic measure, now we can characterize the government policy stance given different sorts of parameter space. Suppose all the other parameters remain unchanged, and improvement in monitoring technology gamma increases SP. And that is to say, if the lender has a very good monitoring technology, and then the government is likely to care more about short-run unemployment stabilization and worry less about future productivity loss. Second, we show an increase in epsilon or n. Epsilon is the price elasticity of demand, and n is the number of entrepreneurs. An increase in both of these parameters simply imply that the oligopoly rent extracted by the producers is going to decrease. And this increases the wage the workers receive. And because now the workers matter more for the aggregate welfare, then the government is likely to care more about the short-term employment stabilization, which is why it increases the government stabilization proclivity. Then we show a decrease in sigma B, which indicates a worsening of the profitability of the inefficient borrowers. That is going to decrease the government stabilization proclivity because profitability is even lower. That would induce the government to care more about future resource allocation. Another interesting case is that if we decrease the beta, which is the discount factor in the social welfare function, then that is going to increase the government's stabilization proclivity, which is quite intuitive because if the government is going to discount the future more, which you can interpret as the government being more myopic and they care more about short-run re-election, let's say, rather than long-run future productivity in 5 years' time, then the government is likely to care more about short-term unemployment stabilization. Now, to further support our analytic propositions, we run numerical examples to illustrate our results. And although this is not a large-scale calibration exercise because the data are not fully available yet, we choose those parameters as close to reality as possible. First, we set the normal time interest rate to 3% per annum to calibrate the discount factor in the social welfare function. And then we choose industry dynamism, phi, the fraction of new workers entering, and alpha, the fraction of profitable prior entrepreneurs, in such a way that it would take 5 years for sector I, the hospitality industry, to reach full employment if the government is extremely hawkish. And then we set N, the number of entrepreneurs, and Q, the total number of workers in the economy, such that each small firm employs 40 workers during normal times, which we think is a plausible figure for small businesses and sole traders. First, I would like to draw your attention to the first subplot on this slide. The horizontal axis indicates M, which is the number of re-entry entrepreneurs. The further to the left, then the harsher the default sanction is. The further to the right, the more lenient the default sanction is. And the vertical axis is the total social welfare. Now, as you can see, the optimal default sanction is somewhere in between the extremely harsh case and the extremely lenient case. And that is the benchmark case, which we take the discount factor to be 0.97. And that is our benchmark case. Now, suppose the government becomes more myopic, the discount factor is going to decrease. The more myopic the government is, or the more the government cares about short-run social welfare, then the more lenient, as you can see, the optimal default sanction is becoming. And that is the takeaway from this figure. Now, let's zoom in on our benchmark case when the social discount factor is set to 0.97. What is going to happen to unemployment and production output? Now, on the left-hand side, I'd like to draw your attention to the green dashed line, and that is the extremely hawkish government that set a very harsh default sanction. As you could see, when the pandemic hits, Sector I is forced to close down, so the output drops to 0, and then it takes 5 periods for the economy to return to the pre-steady state, pre-pandemic level. And during the short term, from period T0 to period 5, the economy suffers persistent unemployment. However, there's no misallocation of resources in the long run. Now, if the government is extremely lenient, and that is the case of the blue dotted line here, the economy jumps immediately after the pandemic is over, but it stays at a lower level than the pre-pandemic scenario. And that is to suggest, in the short run, because the government provides cheap credit and there's a very lenient default sanction associated with that, the sector suffers no unemployment as soon as the pandemic is over, but due to misallocation of resources, the economy stays at a lower level. And the optimal case is somewhere in between. Then we do a lot of comparative statistics to vary different parameters of the model and see how that would change the government policy stance. In the interest of time, I'm just going to show you perhaps one of them. We vary phi, that is the industry dynamism. If we increase phi from 0.1 to 0.2, and that means the industry has lots of new blood coming in every period, and that is going to change the optimal default sanction from a more lenient stance to a harsher stance. Then if we increase the number of entrepreneurs, or increase the industry competitiveness, and that is going to induce the optimal default sanction from a harsher stance to a more lenient stance. The further to the left, the more lenient the default sanction is. Now, just to in the last 2 minutes, I'd like to briefly talk about the implication of low interest rate environment. Now, suppose the economy is at the interest rate lower bound, the interest rate cannot go below 1 over beta minus 1, then in times of the pandemic shock, given these two goods complementarity, the short-term demand shortage is going to lead to involuntary unemployment in sector I, and this is a proposition we prove. Now, unemployment is likely to matter more because whatever happens in sector I is causing an aggregate demand externality, negative externality to the other sector. The implication for the optimal default sanction is that the government might be more lenient or might be more dovish than the counterpart when the interest rate is unconstrained. To sum up, in this paper, we assess the government loan support to small medium enterprises during a pandemic from a normative angle, and the model combines the insights of the IO literature and adverse selection in financial contracting in a macroeconomic framework. And the key focal point is the screening device, Lambda 1, which sits in between the policy trade-off. On the one hand, you can have a pro-stabilization government setting a lenient Lambda 1. On the other hand, you can have a pro-allocation government setting an extremely harsh default sanction. We have demonstrated the optimal default sanction is intermediate. We have also explored the key parameter and the macro financial frictions that determine the government policy stance. And interestingly, as the government becomes more myopic or impatient, the government is likely to set a more lenient default sanction or even provide 100% credit guarantee to the loan support. Then I'd like to wrap up my presentation using the sentence from my co-author, Charles Goodharden. That is, in a crisis, the government tend to be myopic. That said, act in haste, repent at leisure, but extreme pressure does cause extreme myopia. Thank you very much.